You know when you realize someone isn't asking for your opinion, but letting you know what's already been decided. With me, it started so subtly that I almost didn't notice. My son would call, come visit, talk about his life. But something was changing, and I realized exactly when it started. It wasn't a specific day, it was a feeling that grew, like when you sense the temperature has changed but haven't seen the thermometer. He still called me Dad, but I had become something else. My name is Robert. I'm 72 years old, and I've spent the last 40 years building a life that, until recently, I felt made sense. I worked as a civil engineer until I retired, helped build 3 bridges in Ohio, and raised my son alone after my wife died when he was 12. It wasn't easy, but it was honest. I always talked to him about everything, from choosing a college to getting his first job. We had this habit of sitting on the porch on Sundays and catching up. He grew up, got married, had 2 children. I became a grandfather. Life went on. For many years, this rhythm continued. He would call me 2 or 3 times a week. He would spend the weekends here with his family. We would talk about his work, about the grandchildren, about the bills, about politics, about soccer. I helped with some things, he helped me with others. It was a balanced relationship, or at least I thought it was. Until one Sunday he arrived and said almost casually, while grabbing a beer from the fridge, "Dad, we've decided we're going to sell the house and buy a bigger one. We've already started the paperwork." I was sitting in the living room. I heard that and spent a few seconds processing it. Not the information itself, but the way he said it. He hadn't asked me what I thought. He hadn't said, "We're thinking about it." He said, "We've decided." And that, at the time, seemed like just a detail. I replied something like, "Oh, that's good, son. Good luck with the move." He smiled, thanked me, and the conversation continued. But it stayed with me. Not because I needed to be consulted about where he was going to live, but because of the way it was done. It was as if I had been moved from one place to another without realizing it. He continued to treat me well, continued to come here, but something was different. And at that moment, I let it go. After all, he was an adult. He had his own life. It made sense that he would make his own decisions, but it was strange, because before, even as an adult, he always asked me. He always said, "What do you think, Dad?" And now he only informed me. I started paying attention, and I realized that this wasn't the first time, it had just been the clearest. Before I continue, I want to ask you something. If you're listening to this and somehow identify with it, please subscribe to the channel. And leave a comment saying where you're listening from. You don't need to tell your whole story, just say the city, the state, whatever you want. Because these things I'm telling you don't only happen to me, and knowing that you're there on the other side helps me to keep going. This is a conversation between you and me, just the 2 of us. I started noticing the details, small things that in isolation meant nothing, but together they formed a pattern. Like he would call me to say he had changed jobs, not to ask my opinion about the offer, just to let me know he had already signed the contract, or when he told me he was going to send the children to a different private school. They had already enrolled them. They had already paid the first tuition fee. I only found out later. And look, I'm not one of those parents who think they need to control their children's lives. Far from it. But we had a history of talking beforehand, of sharing doubts. And that had changed. One day he came here with his wife, Jennifer. We sat on the porch as usual. She was quiet, a little tense. He started talking about a trip they were going to take to Europe. He said they had bought the tickets, that they would be gone for 3 weeks and that the boys were coming too. I asked when they were leaving. He said, "Next week. Next week." They had probably planned it for months, and I only found out 7 days before. I smiled, said it would be great, that they should enjoy themselves. But inside I began to understand that something had really changed. It wasn't just about practical decisions. It was about the place I occupied in his life. I had become someone who needed to be informed, but not consulted. After they left, I stayed on the porch until it got dark. I kept thinking about when it had started. I tried to remember a conversation, a specific moment when he had said, "Dad, from now on I'm going to do things my way." But there wasn't one. It was gradual. It was silent. And maybe that's exactly why it took me so long to realize. Because there was no fight, There was no distancing. He kept coming here, continued being polite, continued inviting me to lunch from time to time, but I had been reassigned, and the worst part is that I felt it hadn't come only from him. There was another voice there, and I suspected who it was. I realized it early on. I repeated that phrase to myself several times in the following months. I realized it early on, but realizing doesn't mean acting. It means observing, and that's what I did. I stopped waiting for him to ask me things. I stopped offering opinions when they weren't asked for. I simply listened, and the more I listened, the more I understood the pattern. Every time he came here, he brought news. Never doubts. Never questions, only accomplished facts. And I accepted them. Because confronting him wouldn't change anything. It would only create friction. And I didn't want that. One afternoon he came in alone. He sat in his usual chair, had a coffee, and told me he was thinking about investing in a partnership with a friend, a technology company. I asked if he had already spoken to a lawyer, if he had seen the numbers, if he knew this friend well. He said yes, that he had already done all that he had already signed the partnership agreement the previous week. I just nodded. I understand, I said. He kept looking at me, waiting for me to say something else. But I didn't, and he seemed uncomfortable. You could see it. He wanted me to validate his decision, but I wasn't going to do that. Not because I thought the decision was bad, but because validating something that was already done made no difference whatsoever. After that day, I decided one thing. I was going to stop explaining myself. If he wanted to keep me as a decorative piece in his life, someone who received information but didn't participate in the choices, then so be it. But I wasn't going to pretend that it was normal. I wasn't going to pretend that everything was okay. I was just going to accept the role he had given me and observe. Because one thing life has taught me is that whoever makes decisions without listening to anyone eventually makes mistakes on their own. And I wanted to see how far that would go. In the following months, the pattern intensified. He called me less. When he did call, it was quick. "Hi, Dad, how are you? I just wanted to let you know that we're going to renovate the kitchen. It's going to be beautiful." Or, "Dad, we hired someone to take care of the garden at home. It was expensive, but it's worth it." Always like that. Always in the past or present continuous. Never in the conditional future. Never, "we're thinking about it." Always, "we did it. We hired someone. We decided." And I always answered the same thing. "That's great, son." 2 words, nothing more. And that started to bother him. You could tell from his tone of voice. He expected more from me. I expected enthusiasm, approval, maybe even pride. But I didn't give it. One day he arrived here visibly irritated. He sat in the living room, didn't even want coffee. He said, "Dad, you've been very quiet lately. Has something happened?" I looked at him and said, "No, son, everything's fine." He insisted. "No, Dad, you're different. Every time I tell you something, you just say that's good. It seems like you don't care." I took a deep breath. I could have said what I was thinking. I could have explained that he had turned me into a spectator of his life, that I felt out of place, that it hurt more than he imagined. But I didn't say any of that. I just said, "I do care, son. I'm just respecting your choices." He remained silent. And after a few seconds, he got up and left. He didn't come back for 3 weeks. And you know what I did in those 3 weeks? Nothing. I didn't call. I didn't text. I didn't reach out. Because I had understood one thing. He didn't want my opinion. He wanted my approval. And that's different. You ask for an opinion before deciding. You seek approval afterward. And I was no longer willing to be just a source of validation. They thought I didn't understand. They thought I was too old to realize what was happening. But I was noticing everything, every word, every silence, every visit that ended too quickly. When he returned, he came with Jennifer. She was smiling, but it was that forced smile of someone trying to soften a tense situation. They both sat on the sofa. I stayed in my armchair, waiting. He began by saying that they had thought a lot about it, that they were worried about me, that they thought I was isolating myself. I let him speak. When he finished, I asked, "And what do you think I should do?" He exchanged a look with Jennifer. She took a deep breath and said, "We think maybe you need company. There are some clubs nearby for senior citizens. It would be good for you to get out, meet new people." I looked at her. I looked at him, and I asked, "Have you researched these clubs?" He nodded yes. "Have you called any?" He said yes. "Have you gotten information about prices, hours?" He said yes. I smiled. "I understand." It was at that moment that I was sure. They weren't worried about me. They were worried about the image I was projecting. A quiet father who didn't validate their decisions, who wasn't excited about new things, was a problem, because it made them doubt whether they were doing the right things. And they needed to believe they were. So the solution was to keep me busy, to distract me, to put me in a club with other people my age so that I would stop being a silent mirror in their lives. And I understood all of that at that moment. I didn't say anything. I just thanked them for their concern and said I would think about it. They left satisfied, thinking they had solved the problem. But the problem wasn't even mine. In the following days, I started paying attention to something else. To the conversations they had amongst themselves when they thought I wasn't listening. I have good hearing. I always have. And when they came here, they would stay in the kitchen talking while I was in the living room. I heard Jennifer say once, "He won't last long alone here. You need to start thinking about that." And I heard my son reply, "I know, but it's not easy to bring up this subject with him." Bring up what subject, I wondered. And that's when I started putting the pieces together. I had a house, a nice house in a quiet neighborhood with 3 bedrooms, a garage, a backyard. It was mine, paid for, built with money I'd saved over decades of work. And I lived alone. To many people that might seem like a waste, but to me it was freedom. It was the result of a lifetime of effort. But apparently to my son and Jennifer, it was something else. It was an asset, and assets need to be managed. I started to notice that their visits had a new layer. They looked at the house differently. They commented on the state of things. "Dad, that faucet is dripping. Aren't you going to fix it?" "Dad, the roof needs maintenance, did you see?" "Dad, this garden is too big for you to take care of alone." I fixed the faucet. I called someone to look at the roof. I mowed the lawn. But they kept finding problems. And I began to understand that the problem wasn't the house. It was me. Living alone in a large house at 72 was seen as irresponsible, as stubbornness, as a lack of vision, and they were starting to build a narrative. I realized this when, at a Sunday lunch, Jennifer commented to a friend of hers in front of me that caring for elderly parents is a responsibility that we can't ignore. And my son agreed. He nodded, said it was true, that many people leave it too late to think about it, and I was sitting there, listening, as if I wasn't in the room. I decided to do a test. I stopped fixing the little things. I let the tap drip. I let the garden grow a little more. I wanted to see how far they would go. And they went far. On the next visit, my son said, "Dad, we need to have a serious talk. You can't take care of this house anymore." I looked at him and asked, "Who said that?" He hesitated. "Nobody needed to say it, Dad. It's obvious. Look at the state of things here." I took a deep breath. "I can take care of my house, son. I was just busy with other things." He didn't seem convinced. And that's when he blurted out, "We were thinking that maybe it's time for you to consider living in a smaller place, or even with us." I looked at my son and said, "Thank you for the offer, but I'm fine here." He was frustrated. You could see it. "Dad, you need to be realistic. You're 72 years old. What if something happens? What if you fall? What if you need help?" I replied, "If I need help, I'll ask." He shook his head, as if talking to a stubborn child, and he left. But I knew it wasn't over, and he didn't have it. In the following weeks, he returned to the subject in different ways. He brought brochures about condominiums for seniors. He brought information about smaller houses, more easier to manage. He even brought a list of companies that made adaptations for elderly people. Each time he brought something, I thanked him and put it aside. And each time I did that, he became more impatient. Until one day he arrived with Jennifer and another person, a lawyer. He didn't warn me beforehand. He simply rang the doorbell and came in with the two of them. They sat in the living room. The lawyer was young, probably about 35 years old. He was wearing a suit, he had a briefcase, and he started talking about estate planning. I let him talk. He explained about wills, about powers of attorney, about how important it was to organize these things before it was too late. He said that many families went through problems because they left everything to the last minute. He said that I, as a responsible man, should think about it. And while he was talking, I looked at my son, and at Jennifer, and I realized that they had rehearsed it, they had planned it. They had decided that this was the best way to convince me. When the lawyer finished, I thanked him for the visit, and I said I would think about it. The lawyer left a card. They left. And I was left alone looking at that card, understanding exactly what was happening. They were making progress, and they thought I didn't notice. I stopped explaining myself. That phrase became my mantra, because every time I tried to say I was okay, that I could take care of myself, that I didn't need help, they interpreted it as denial, as stubbornness, as a sign that I really needed help. So, I stopped. I stopped trying to convince them. I stopped justifying my choices. I stopped defending myself. And this, curiously, accelerated their process, because silence was interpreted as confirmation. If I wasn't defending myself, it was because I couldn't anymore. If I wasn't arguing, it was because I was losing my lucidity, and they felt authorized to move on. My son started coming here more often, but not to visit me, to check in. He would look inside the refrigerator, check if I was eating properly. He would look at the medication I took for my blood pressure, ask if I was taking it at the right times. He would look all over the house, as if he were doing an inspection. And I let him. Because the more he did it, the more convinced he became that I needed supervision. And the more convinced he became, the closer I got to seeing the mistake he was going to make. I just had to wait. And I'm good at waiting. I always have been. One day, he came here and asked me to sign some papers. He said it was just a formality to make things easier if I needed help in the future. He said it was a power of attorney, nothing special, that many people did. I took the papers. I read them. It wasn't a simple power of attorney. It was a broad, irrevocable power of attorney that gave him total control over my finances and medical decisions. I looked at him and asked, "Do you think I can't read?" He was disconcerted. He stammered. He said that wasn't it, that he just wanted to help, that the lawyer had said it was the best thing to do. I handed the papers back and said, "I'm not going to sign this." He turned red. For the first time, he was angry with me. And he said, "Dad, you're being irresponsible. We just want to protect you." I replied, "I didn't ask for protection." He stormed out, slamming the door. After that day, he disappeared. He didn't call. "You didn't come here." I went 2 weeks without news, and I knew what was happening. He was consulting someone. I was looking for another way to do what I wanted to do, because he had become convinced that I wasn't fully capable of deciding for myself. And when someone becomes convinced of that, no argument can change their mind, only reality. And reality was about to knock on his door. I just didn't know yet how, but I knew it would. Because people who make decisions alone, who don't listen to anyone, who think they know what's best for others, always make mistakes. And mistakes have consequences. Meanwhile, I continued with my life. I woke up early, had coffee, read the newspaper, tended the garden. I went to the market. I talked to the neighbors. I did everything I always did. Because there was nothing wrong with me. I was lucid, healthy, independent. But in my son's mind, I was something else. I was a problem to be solved. And this difference in perception was going to cost him dearly. I just didn't know how yet. Until one Thursday afternoon the phone rang. It was Jennifer. Her voice was different, tense. She asked if I could go to their house. She said it was urgent. I asked what had happened. She didn't want to talk on the phone. I said I would go. When I got there, my son was sitting in the living room, his head in his hands. Jennifer was pacing back and forth. I sat down and asked what had happened. My son looked up and said, "Dad, I made a mistake." And then he told me, remember that partnership with his friend in the tech company? The one he told me about after he'd already signed the contract. Well, his friend had embezzled money. The company was being sued. And my son, as a partner, was jointly liable. He could lose everything. His house, his savings, everything. And he didn't know what to do. He looked at me, waiting for me to have an answer, waiting for me to solve it. And I, for the first time in months, felt something like relief. Not because he was in trouble, but because finally he was asking for help, not warning me, asking. I looked at him and Jennifer. They were desperate. And I could have said, "I told you so." I could have reminded them that when he told me about the partnership, I had asked if he knew his friend well, if he had seen the numbers, if he had consulted a lawyer. But I didn't say any of that. Because humiliating someone who's already down isn't a victory, it's cruelty. So I just asked, "How much?" He gave an amount. It was high, very high, more than he could pay on his own, more than his savings covered. He would need to sell the house, or take out a huge loan, or declare bankruptcy. And he was paralyzed, not knowing where to begin. I took a deep breath. "Do you have the company documents?" He nodded. "Do you have the company's bank statements?" He said he would get them. "Have you spoken to a lawyer specializing in corporate law?" He said no. I picked up my cell phone and called an acquaintance of mine, a good, serious lawyer who had helped me a few times in the past. I scheduled a meeting for the next day. I hung up and looked at my son. "Tomorrow at 10 o'clock you will be at his office with all the documents. He will guide you on the next steps. But you need to be honest. You need to tell him everything, understand?" He nodded. He was emotional. He thanked me. And for the first time in a long time I felt like I was talking to my son again, not someone who only informed me of things, but the irony of the situation didn't go unnoticed. He had spent months trying to get me out of my house, put me in a condominium, take control of my finances because he thought I was no longer capable of taking care of myself. And now he was sitting in front of me, asking for help because he had made a disastrous financial decision without consulting anyone, because he had trusted blindly, because he had thought he knew what he was doing, and he didn't. I didn't say any of this out loud, but I thought it, and I kept it to myself. In the following days, I closely followed the process. The lawyer analyzed everything. The situation was complicated, but not impossible. There was a way out, but it would hurt. My son would have to liquidate investments, sell the car, tighten his belt, and it would take time to recover. But he wouldn't lose the house. He wouldn't declare bankruptcy. He would get through this, with scars, but he would get through it. And during this whole process, something changed. He started asking me things. Before making any decision, he would call. "Dad, the lawyer suggested this. What do you think?" "Dad, I'm thinking about doing that. Does it make sense?" And I would answer, calmly, with experience, with the voice of someone who had already been through a lot in life. And Jennifer changed too. She, who before barely looked me in the eye, began to treat me with respect. He started listening to me, because she had realized the obvious. I wasn't the problem. I never was. The problem was arrogance, the certainty that decisions made alone, without consulting those with more experience, are always the best. And now they were paying the price for that certainty. But I didn't like seeing my son suffer. I never liked it. Even with everything that had happened, even with the way he had treated me in recent months, he was still my son. And I was going to help him. Not because he deserved it, but because that's what parents do. But while I was helping, something was unfolding. I had documents, I had proof. Of all the times he had tried to make me sign powers of attorney, of all the conversations about taking me out of my house, of all the times he had acted as if I were incapable. And one of those days, talking to the lawyer about his situation, I mentioned this in passing. I mentioned that I had been pressured into signing documents I didn't want to sign. The lawyer stopped. He looked at me and said, "Did you keep those papers?" I said yes. He asked to see them. I showed him. He read them and he became serious. "Robert, you know this is attempted coercion, right? You could sue. I looked at him. I'm not going to sue my son. He nodded. I understand. But you need to protect your interests. Let me draft a document for you. Something that makes it clear that you are in full possession of your mental faculties and that you do not authorize anyone to make decisions for you. I agreed. The document was drafted, registered at the notary's office, signed by me with witnesses, and filed away. I didn't show it to my son. I didn't need to. It was a protection. Insurance. In case he ever again had ideas about taking control of my life. And I knew he wouldn't, not after everything that had happened, but I wanted to be sure, because blindly trusting was no longer an option, not for me, not for him. We had both learned that the hard way. Meanwhile, his situation was being resolved. It took 4 months, but in the end he managed to pay off his debts, close the partnership, and get out of the legal process. He was exhausted. He was older, but he was free, and he was different. One Sunday he came here alone. He sat on the porch. He was silent for a few minutes. Then he said, "Dad, I need to apologize." I looked at him. For what? He took a deep breath. For treating you like a child. For thinking I knew better. For trying to control your life while mine was falling apart. I was silent. He continued, "I realized that, in recent years, I stopped listening to you. I stopped respecting you as someone with more experience, more wisdom. I saw you as someone who needed care, and not as someone who still had so much to teach." He was emotional, and so was I. But I didn't cry. I just put my hand on his shoulder and said, "Son, life teaches in its own way, and sometimes it hurts. But you learned. And that's what matters." And it was true, he had learned, but at a high cost. He had almost lost everything. He had spent months in agony, fear, and uncertainty, because he had made a decision without thinking it through, without consulting anyone, without listening to those with more experience, and that decision almost destroyed him. But in the end, it saved him from something worse, because he learned the right lesson. He learned that age is not synonymous with inability. He learned that experience has value. He learned that listening is not weakness, it's intelligence. And I, seeing all this, felt that something had closed. A cycle, a story, that began with him excluding me from his decisions and ended with him asking me to participate again. The following months were different. He started calling me again before making important decisions. He started asking for my opinion again, not about everything, because he was an adult and had his own life, but about the things that mattered. And I answered honestly, carefully, without imposing, without controlling, just sharing what I knew. And he listened, truly. Jennifer also changed. She started including me in conversations. She started asking my opinion about things in their house, about the grandchildren, about future plans, and I felt like I had regained my place, not as someone who controlled, but as someone who mattered. One day my oldest grandson, Michael, came here. He was about 15 years old. He sat with me on the porch and asked, "Grandpa, is it true that you helped my father when he almost lost everything?" I looked at him. "Who told you that?" He said, "My father. He said you saved him." I smiled. "I didn't save anyone, Michael. I just helped him find his way. The rest, he did on his own." The boy became thoughtful. Then he said, "My father also said that he had treated you badly, that he had tried to control you, and that was wrong." I nodded. "Your father learned, Michael, and that's what matters. Everyone makes mistakes. The important thing is to learn from the mistake." And it was true. My son had made a mistake. With me. With himself. But he had learned. And now, he was passing that on to his children. He was teaching them that respect has no age limit, that experience has value, that decisions made alone, without listening to anyone, often lead to disaster. And I felt proud of that. Because in the end, it wasn't about me being right. It was about him becoming a better person, more humble, wiser. And that, to me, was worth more than any victory. There was a moment, a few months after everything had been resolved, when I was alone here at home sitting on the porch looking at the garden, and I thought about everything that had happened, how it all began, with small exclusions, with decisions made without me, with a son who had reclassified me from advisor to spectator, and how that had evolved, to attempts to remove me from my home, to take control of my finances, to treat me as if I were incapable, and how everything had crumbled for him precisely when he most needed to prove that he knew what he was doing. And I realized something that perhaps you who are listening to me have also realized. When someone excludes you from decisions, it's not because you don't matter. It's because deep down, that person is afraid of being judged, afraid of being questioned, afraid of admitting they don't know everything. And so instead of asking for help, they push you away. They turn you into someone who needs to be informed, but not consulted. And the more they do this, the more they isolate themselves, the more they convince themselves they are right, until reality hits them. And then they come back. Not because they change their mind about you, but because they have nowhere else to go. And when that happens, you have two choices. You can get revenge. You can say, "I told you so." You can humiliate. You can refuse to help. Or you can do what I did. You can help. Not because the person deserves it, but because you are bigger than their mistake. Because you understand that everyone makes mistakes. And that the difference between growing and withering lies in how you deal with mistakes, yours and others. And I chose to help. Because in the end, he was my son. And children, no matter how many mistakes they make, no matter how much they hurt, are still children. And true parents don't give up. Today, when I look back, I see everything clearly. I see that my son was scared. Scared of the idea of growing old. Scared of the responsibility of taking care of me one day. And in the midst of that fear, he made wrong decisions. He tried to take control before it was necessary. He tried to solve a problem that didn't yet exist. And in the process, he almost created a chasm between us. But the chasm didn't form. Because I chose not to dig, I chose to observe, I chose to wait, and I chose to help when the time came. And today, our relationship is better than it was. Not the same. Better. Because now there is true respect, there is recognition, there is gratitude, and I learned something too. I learned that silence is not weakness, that observing is not passivity, that waiting is not giving up. Sometimes the greatest strength you can have is the ability to remain quiet while others rush towards the precipice, because shouting doesn't help, warning doesn't work. Sometimes people need to fall. They need to feel the impact. They need to understand firsthand that they were wrong. And when that happens, you can be there, not to say "I told you so," but to help them get up, if you want to, if you think it's worth it. And in my case it was, because he was my son. And a father's love has no bank account, no demands, no limits. So, if you're listening to me and somehow identify with this story, I want you to know one thing. Not every warning is a favor. Not every person is ready to listen. And your role isn't always to convince. Sometimes your role is simply to exist, to be there, to be the rock that doesn't move while everything around you crumbles. And when it's all over, when the dust settles, you'll still be standing, and people will remember that. They'll remember that you didn't run away, you didn't abandon, you didn't give up. And that's the greatest legacy you can leave. Not of someone who was right, but of someone who was present. Today, I'm 72 years old. I live in my house, I take care of my life, and I have my son back, for real. And that for me is enough. If you've made it this far, I want to thank you for listening to me, for staying with me until the end. And if this story resonated with you, if you saw yourself in any part of it, please like this video, subscribe to the channel if you haven't already, because these stories continue, and I will continue sharing them, not because I have all the answers, but because sometimes knowing that someone has already gone through what you're going through is something, and I know what it's like to go through it. I know what it's like to wait. I know what silence is. And I know what it is in the end to be at peace, And that's what I want for you too, peace truly. Until next time.